Okay, it looks like we're on page 47 of the Vegetarian Myth, which looks like we're maybe halfway through this impossible second chapter. Continuing along. The problem is exacerbated by a rise in the water table. We were talking about how drier regions that need irrigation and won't have enough ambient rainfall to wash away the salts. So that's where we were when we stopped. Again, you're getting a nice view of what was snow on the ground this morning when I woke up, but is now barren ground because it's all melted, but there was a layer of snow everywhere. I didn't have my glasses on and I didn't go out and look. I was too disgusted to look. Second time I got up, there was still a little snow on the ground, but it was melting fast. The third time I got up, there was no snow on the ground. Had I not had to go to the bathroom twice, I would never have known it snowed. Anyway, back to the vegetarian myth. The problem is exacerbated by a rise in the water table that, in the absence of adequate natural or artificial drainage, naturally follows the flood irrigation of low-lying lands. It can take years, generations even, but eventually the water table gets close enough to the surface that evaporative capillary action starts. Now, as water evaporates off the surface of the soil, it pulls up more water from below, which then also evaporates. I can see that this is going to be a problem. And all this water leaves salt behind. Think of a hot day, how your skin gets slightly sticky with salt from moisture evaporating off your surfaces. It's the same process. Desperate farmers across millennia have tried to save their land by applying more irrigation to flush salts out. But this only accelerates the problem by raising the water table higher. Entire civilizations have collapsed as a result of doing this to their land, and the process is well underway in the major grain-growing regions around the world. Ooh, a nice bird. In case you need more convincing, I have in front of me a list of birds. Swainson warbler is a small bird, 5 to 6 inches, with a big voice. It pokes its bill inside fallen leaves to uncurl them in search of insects. Condition at hatching, writes the Cornell Ornithology Lab, helpless and naked. The Arcadian flycatcher can hover and fly backwards. The black tern, with its gorgeous, glossy breeding plumage and its gregarious nature, will live in flocks that could number in the tens of thousands. Try to imagine the sky awash with 20 or 30,000 birds. The male canvasback duck makes sweet coos when he's courting, and the female, like many bird mothers, pulls the down off her body to line her nest. Well, typical mother. I won't belabor this. The list of birds is a roll call of the damned, and it stretches from here to hell. And any bird dependent on a river will find its name written there. Because I have a list of rivers I've never even heard of, that are being destroyed for irrigation. They're being diverted and drained to grow crops like wheat, rice, and cotton, and also for industrial processes like hydroelectricity and dye works. 70% of all water from rivers and underground reservoirs is being spread onto irrigated land that grows 1/3 of the world's food, writes Fred Pierce in When the Rivers Run Dry, a book that will break your heart. In Egypt, Mexico, Pakistan, and Australia, and across Central Asia, 90% or more of the water abstracted from the environment is for irrigation. Green Revolution crops deliver more grain per acre, but in order to do it, they use more water. The water has to come from somewhere, and that means more dams, more wells, more diversion, and more salinization. Not only are we using non-renewable fossil water from deep inside aquifers that recharge at a glacial speed, if at all, but projects that initially greened the desert are now creating desert. Worldwide, 25 million acres of arable land are lost each year to salinization. Take Pakistan as an example. The Indus River supplies irrigation water for 90% of Pakistan's crops. Keep in mind that very little grain is fed to animals in Asia and Africa. Chapter 3 will address this more fully, if we ever get to Chapter 3, assuming Chapter 2 ever ends. She didn't say that, I did. 100,000 acres each year are abandoned because of salinization. That's 1/10 of Pakistan's fields lost to date. Another 1/5 are waterlogged, and another 1/4 are barely producing. Karachi is the fastest growing city in the world, exploding with a population of environmental refugees. In some parts of the Sindh province, over half the land is barren. The Indus River, one of the original sites of civilization, now runs dry for its last few hundred miles. The delta of the Indus, and feel free to insert Mississippi, Ganges, Ebro, Yellow, or Volta here, was a species-dense series of wetland marshes filled with fish, birds, and dolphins. But the march to the sea is happening in reverse. Without the silt that the river once carried, the delta is eroding. Without the barrier of a delta, the sea is encroaching. 1,000,000 acres that were once mangrove swamps are now dead, drowned beneath the ocean. Or take India. 2/3 of India's crops are dependent on underground water. Wells in northern Gujarat once filled with water at 30 feet. Now wells at 1,300 feet run dry. That's from 30 feet, 30, to 1,300, 1300. Entire districts in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat are being depopulated. As the floods from the rivers fade, first into desert and then into myth, another flood takes their place, a flood of people from the countryside into slum-bloated cities. Rice, wheat, corn, the annual grains that vegetarians want the world to eat, are thirsty enough to drink whole rivers. Countries dependent on Green Revolution crops have a water consumption rate several times that of Europe. Per capita, Pakistan abstracts 5 times more water per person than Ireland does. Egypt, 5 times more water than Britain, and Mexico, 5 times more than Denmark. Irrigation doesn't just destroy wetlands and riparian systems. As the water table drops, any trees left standing beneath the plow die of thirst as their roots no longer reach water. All that's left is dust, and the dust builds into storms, spreading, for instance, from China's wheat fields across Asia, choking lungs in Beijing, closing schools in Korea, dusting cars in Japan, and raining onto mountains and across the Pacific and western Canada. The Yellow River begins in the plateaus of Tibet in an area called the county. It does say county. Should be country. Anyway, the county of thousands of lakes. Over half of those lakes are only a memory on a map, having disappeared into wheat and rice below. The World Bank warns of the catastrophic consequences if China is unable to feed its people. The rivers are also warning us, although they can't speak English. Of China's 23,000 miles of large rivers, 80% don't support fish anymore. If the earth could write a report, we would forgive it for using only 2 spare words. 80%. Set aside the fossil fuel for the fertilizer and transportation. If you live in Burlington, Vermont, or Santa Cruz, California, and you eat rice, ubiquitous vegan brown rice, this is what you're eating: dead fish and dead birds from a dying river. It takes anywhere from 250 to 650 gallons of water to grow a pound of rice. Pretend your rice was grown in North America. Picture Texas or California. They're dry grasslands of short-stem prairies, or they should be. Now picture rice, tropically lush with green and up to its neck in water. Where does that water come from? Now substitute home for water. Long-nosed gar and roseate spoonbills, American alligators, and piping plovers. There's death on your plate, an entire ecosystem's worth. But it happened out past the asphalt, far, far out in a world we will never know. Some of these projects are worse than others. Wheat on the edge of the Gobi Desert, 130 gallons of water a pound. Rice and Sind, 250 to 650 gallons a pound. Confinement dairy cows in the Sonora Desert, 500 to 1,000 gallons of water for a quart of milk. Tony Allen, a water specialist, calls it madness, and it is. But the good and the bad are only different in degree, not kind. Damming rivers kills them. So obviously does draining them. Irrigation is bound to create solidization. Like any conquering army, agriculturalists salt the land, until what's left is asphalt and desert, variations on the theme called civilization. The Logoni River in Cameroon gets its water from the Congo rainforest. The river and its floodplain have been the mainstay of hunters and fishermen, producing rich wildlife for millennia. The Fulani, the largest nomadic population of the world, have used the area for centuries. Then along came a state-owned rice company and its dam. The plan was to use the water to irrigate rice paddies. One dam and 60 miles of embankment later, the floodplain and its species-rich ecosystem were destroyed. You could condense my entire book into the next 2 sentences, and here they are. Rich pastures of perennial grasses died so that some 20,000 head of cattle had to move away. Fish yields fell by 90%. I'll read those lines. I guess it is 2 sentences. I'll read them again. Rich pastures of perennial grasses died so that some 20,000 head of cattle had to move away. Fish yields fell by 90%. Agriculture has wiped out everything in its path, including the humans. Considering this is Africa, they'd probably been living off of some version of this pattern ruminants on grass, fish from the rivers, animals integrated into perennial polycultures for 4 million years. We could round out the cliff notes with 3 more sentences. Meanwhile, elephants and lions in the Waza National Park, one of the last refuges in Central and West Africa, fled as their water holes dried up. With the entire floodplain in crisis, the human inhabitants fought over water and pastures. Many left for distant cities. This sequence has been repeating itself for 10,000 years. The last people who know how to live sustainably, how to integrate themselves into the living landscape of grasslands and rivers, are pushed off by the agriculturalists to disappear into a hostile world while, like the animals, they will surely die. We are all these people because in the end none of us can live without grasslands and rivers, oceans and forests. Money, especially money accumulated into wealth, may buffer us for a while, but the needle is almost empty. We're out of topsoil, out of water, out of species, and out of space in the atmosphere for the carbon we can't seem to stop burning. Then there's the Mississippi. Never mind the Indus and the Lagoni. Realistically, most of us in the U.S. couldn't draw those on a map. But the Mississippi runs through the heart of this continent and in many ways through the heart of this book. Only 2% of the U.S. rivers and wetlands are free-flowing. Less than half of the original wetlands remain. Along the Mississippi and its tributaries, only 20% of the bottomland hardwood forests are left, cut off from the rivers by levees. Those are doomed to slow starvation. Along with a final roll call of animals, canvasback duck, American crocodile, carries her babies to the water at her mouth. Hawksbill sea turtle, Louisiana black bear, Gulf sturgeon. You don't need to hear the rest. What you do need to hear is that the river has been destroyed for agriculture. To grow grain in areas with hot, dry summers requires water. Not a living river, but water. A real river floods. The wetlands luxuriate in silt and moisture, then slowly release the water back to the river. But agriculturalists want land. They take it from the forests and prairies and marshes, and they don't want it to flood. And once food is turned into a commodity, it has to be transported from where it's literally mined from the last of the dead prairie soils to the population centers along the coast from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine, and across the world. So the river is turned to water, confined to concrete channels cut deep enough for barges that carry the oil and gas to fuel all this, and for the barges that ship tons of annual grains that will become your daily bread. The channels stop the fresh river water from feeding the marshes and swamps in the vacuum filled by the salt water. And digging deep enough for the barges also increases the flow of salt water entering marshes and swamps. The salt, of course, kills them. Meanwhile, snowmelts and heavy rain increase the volume and velocity of the water in the channels. Without wetlands to absorb the excess, the force of the water builds until the inevitable floods are catastrophic. Writes Ted Williams, quote, "The only flood protection that ever worked is wetlands," unquote. When the water does finally explode into the Gulf, it's carrying a burden of nutrients, nitrogen runoff from row crops and factory-farmed animal manure, beyond what the normal balance of life forms can absorb. The excess nitrogen causes algae to grow exponentially. As the algae die, the bacteria step up to the dinner plate. Now there's an abundance of bacteria, and they need oxygen. They need so much of it that nothing else breathing can live there. Anything that can swim fast enough gets out of the way. Anything that can't dies. There is a dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi that's the size of New Jersey. Fertilizing with synthetic nitrogen leads to runoff because those fertilizers destroy the biological activity, the life of the soil. Fertilizing with manure is ethically unacceptable to moral vegetarians who consider domestication exploitation, and to political vegetarians who think all arable land should be dedicated to growing annual grains. Desert and dead zones are the end point of an agriculture of annuals with no animals. Yet the farms in the Mississippi watershed could apply fertilizer more sparingly. Please apply it more sparingly. Maybe we could have a dead zone the size of Rhode Island instead. But is that really what you want to argue for? Here's the world I want. Before the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers improved the river, as it likes to say, there were no flood walls and levees for the Mississippi to blast through. It did not drown or render homeless the Americans who lived beside it and who simply moved their teepees when it languidly inhaled. On high ground, they waited for the river to creep and seep through a rich mosaic of wooded islands, wild rice fields, sloughs, meadows, woods, ponds, and prairies, delivering seeds, renewing the earth with its gentle snow of sediment. With these annual inhalations came the floodplain spawners, Bigmouth and smallmouth buffalo fish and scores of others, depopulating drought-killed oxbows, easing through flooded timber and grasses, broadcasting eggs. Fry would fatten on plankton blooms, and in summer, fingers of the gradually falling river would shepherd them back, leaving vast mudflats that fed migrating shorebirds. Otters gorged on fish. Cougars patrolled canebrakes. Wolves hunted beavers in the bottomland forests. On their spring and fall migrations, ducks, geese, and other water birds streamed up and down the Mississippi's reach, resting and feeding in vast wetlands renewed by the unconfined river. That's the world she wants. And beside the river was a prairie that nurtured bison, antelope, gray wolves, and black-footed ferrets, and humans. We lived there once, too. Not on it, but in it. We do have a choice, but it's not between life or death. It's between being predators or destroyers. Between food that we live inside and food that we impose across the world. The Klamath Refuge System is used by 80% of the migrating waterfowl along the Pacific Flyway. Oh, it's a gorgeous place, too. I love driving across it at night. Oh, my God, it's gorgeous. I turn off this is me talking, not her. I turn off my headlights and just drive through there. It's a beautiful swamp, miles and no cars. I mean, if you see 5 cars for an hour and a half, it's a busy day. Gorgeous. I've seen so many animals there. It was just the most incredible place to drive. Anyway, that's the Klamath Refuge System. Klamath Lake hosts we're back to her book. The Klamath Lake hosts the biggest population of bald eagles in the continental U.S. Yes, I used to see a lot of them. The Klamath River was once the 3rd most productive salmon river system in North America. The salmon runs have been reduced over 90%. That's 90. It's so bad for some species, they're considered endangered. Salmon are called a keystone species. Quote, a keystone species is a species that has a disproportionate effect on its environment relative to its abundance. Such an organism plays a role in its ecosystem that is analogous to the role of a keystone in an arch. While the keystone feels the least pressure of any of the stones in an arch still collapses without it. Similarly, an ecosystem may experience a dramatic shift if a keystone species is removed, even though that species was a small part of the ecosystem by measures of biomass or productivity. End quote. In the case of the Northwest salmon, their spawning bodies bring a huge influx of nutrients to other inhabitants of the river. They feed bears, otters, herons, eagles. Tons of nitrogen are embodied in the fish and distributed through the riparian community as the animals eat, digest, and defecate. Through this nutrient cycle, the fish feed the trees, and this is important because the trees are crucial to the life of the river. The trees provide shade, which keeps the river cool enough for aquatic life. Trees store the water that comes as spring rain and snow melt, and then release it slowly as the ground slowly dries in warmer weather. This keeps water levels high enough to provide oxygen for fish. Fish feed trees, trees protect fish. Between fish and trees is a whole glissando of species, from Daphnia to eagles, and underneath them all is the soil. Beside the Klamath River is a long string of farms. Never mind that the region only gets 12 inches of rainfall a year. The river gives up its water for the farm. Thanks to the Klamath Irrigation Project, most of the water from the river basin in Oregon has been dammed and diverted for irrigation. In 2002, the water levels got so low that between 34,000 and 68,000 fish died. They gasped and struggled and finally suffocated. Their bodies bloated and rotted, and I'm told the stench was unspeakable. This was done for the sake of agricultural products, potatoes, grain, onions, and for cattle. 2 months later, I sat in a meeting at an activist conference. We were radical, righteous, and wrangling over food. The conference had served only vegetarian meals, but a growing number of us found that inadequate. Was there room for a range of options? No, because innocent animals shouldn't have to die. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, there was a whole shelf of lettuce in the fridge. Where was it grown? Who knows, besides far, far away. Probably California's Central Valley, where the water birds were once so thick over the Sacramento River that they blocked out the sun. But the river and its wetlands have been bled to death for agriculture, to grow lettuce, tomatoes, artichokes, non-violent, vegetarian, inherently more sustainable than animal-sourced foods. Or such was the stand taken by my comrades. And on the kitchen counter were 3 bags of potatoes marked product of Oregon. No innocent rivers died for my food, I wanted to shoot back. But I am over 30, so I took a deep breath and sighed. It's not just what's dead on your plate, I tried to explain. There are way bigger questions you have to ask. Nobody wanted to ask them. But this is my book, so I'll ask them here. What can feed humans on 12 inches of rainfall a year? Extend the question with the clause, without destroying such a brittle environment. A brittle environment with a river running through it. Why go through all the trouble of damming up and destroying a river dense with fertility and food, and then all the work of planting onions and alfalfa and wheat when you could just sit back and wait for the fish year after year from now until forever? Is this insane, or is it just me? Cattle or other ruminants like elk could eat the native grasses, though in much smaller numbers than the thirsty alfalfa could support. Any attempt to grow annual crops, whether for animal feed or for vegetarian staples like wheat or soy, will destroy this land. It will ultimately destroy most land, but you'll see the results faster in an arid environment. The moral vegetarians believe, and they believe it with all their hearts and with all their good reasons, that the question is life or death. But that is not the choice that nature offers any of us. We are all apple trees and coho salmon, earthworms and black terns, predators and then prey. Life or death is not the question that will save us. But this could be. What grows where you live? Ask it and you'll see. To answer, you'll have to know the place you live. And if your food, your survival, is dependent upon the place that starts at your beating heart and extends as far as your legs can walk in a day, then you will have to learn about rivers and forests and soil and rain, writes Derek Jensen, quote. And I love this quote, even though I can't stand either one of these people anymore. If your experience is that your food comes from the grocery store, your water from the tap, from the economic system, from the social system we call civilization, it is to this you will pledge back your life. If your experience is that food and water come from your land base, you will make and keep promises to your land base in exchange for this food. You will be responsible to the community that supplies you with food and water. You will defend this community to your very death. End quote. What grows where you live means what can grow, what should grow, who should grow it. And for all of us, it means who is destroying the place where you live. Corrupt or even totalitarian governments, a political dictator, a sociopathic economic system that turns corporate boards into legal persons with no responsibility to anything except shareholder profits, coal or timber companies, the triumvirate of oil, auto, and construction industries that is literally paving the road to hell, the World Bank, or there's simply too many people to ever eat sustainably from your food shed. Over 100 countries depend on grain from Canada and the U.S., and that grain constitutes 60% of all exports. For that matter, Massachusetts imports 85% of its food. The last time Massachusetts was self-sufficient for food, there were half as many people, and the land was 90% deforested. So we've got a problem. Because there are too many people for the land, any land to support, we consistently face Hobson's choice. Do we grow as much as we can locally and destroy the local land base? Or do we import and destroy somewhere else? So what grows where you live becomes why are there so many of us? This leads into the question of who controls women's bodies. Those of us who are women. Oh, wait a minute. This leads into the question of who controls women's bodies. Those of us who actually are women, or are women just another resource for men to use in their endless quest to prove their toxic masculinity and breed soldiers for civilization's constant state of war? The masculinity and the war against people, against the planet, together have created a perpetual motion machine of domination and destruction of the land and human rights. We will need to stop both to save this planet. This is why militarism is a feminist issue, why rape is an environmental issue, why environmental destruction is a peace issue. I like that line too. This is why militarism is a feminist issue, rape an environmental issue, environmental destruction a peace issue. It's all connected. Okay, continuing with the book. Those are all huge spit-outs of the same beginning place of objectification, the process of turning living beings into things. The rain, the river, the long-stem grasses. Are they members of your community? Do you live inside your food shed? Or is the living land just topsoil to be used until it's dust? Are your human neighbors in other countries participants in a common project of care and connection? Or are they labor units to assemble your cell phones? And how many soldiers will it take to keep them assembling? If you are a man, do women exist to make you dinner and sons? If you are a woman, you must surely burn for more. And for all of us, the planet is dying under civilization's regime. What will it take for us to fight back? What grows where you live? One small question that could save the world. At this point in my education, the desperate vegan in me had to concede the following. Agriculture isn't possible on 2/3 of the world's land. It's too cold, too steep, too wet, too dry. My answer to this? Fine, then people shouldn't live there. That I lived in one such place, New England, with its cold, rocky hills of thin acid soil, was bracketed out of consciousness. New England was naturally forested, and agriculture was never appropriate for much of this land, I read, and promptly forgot. I also conceded that growing annual monocrops in the places it was possible would destroy the soil eventually. I answered this with a prayer to Wes Jackson, hoping that he'd be successful in my lifetime, and a vague plan to grow a lot of nut trees where my longed-for farm materialized. I conceded that irrigation was indefensible. I had no problem there. If it meant a smaller human population, well, we had to get to work on lowering our numbers and raising the status of women. I conceded that I would need domesticated animals, their labor and the products of their bodies, to farm sustainably. I needed their manure and their unspeakable bones, their inconceivable blood. I slipped back and forth across a very narrow ethical line, aghast at my own willingness to even consider participating in domestication, which was by definition the exploitation of animals. How could I stop the insects that were after my food? Chickens and ducks were the permaculture answer, in complete opposition to the vegan answer. And what about the fertilizer? Maybe I could find another source of unused manure. Well, maybe I could, but that's like suggesting dumpster diving as a solution to economic oppression. I'd only be skimming the excess and pretending. The basic fact remains, somebody had to keep those cows and goats so I could use the manure. Animals exploited for milk, meat, and eggs were necessary for my food, whether I kept or ate them or not. Maybe, I inched toward the site of evil, maybe I could have them without exploiting them. I could adopt animals nobody wanted, old hens, boy goats, let them live out their natural lives, and in exchange I could have their manure and their bug eating services. All right, fine, it was a compromise, depended on meat and milk, but the animals were already here. They didn't have to die, did they? Because lots of other things did. I was locked in mortal combat with the slugs. In dry years, they damaged the garden. In rainy years, they devastated it. I'd plant starts that were eaten to the ground 24 hours later. And she doesn't even have mice. Poison was out of the question. It would kill and keep on killing the 1,000,001 microbes I was trying to encourage. The birds, the reptiles, bioaccumulating up the food chain, spreading another shadow of cancer and genetic damage across the darkening planet. So I tried an organic solution, diatomaceous earth. It worked. In 2 days, the garden was slug-free and the lettuce was mine. Then I found out how it worked. Diatomaceous earth is the ancient bodies of small prehistoric creatures ground into powder. Each grain of powder has tiny sharp edges. It kills by mechanical action. Soft-bellied animals like slugs crawl across it and it slices a million cuts into their skin. They die from slow dehydration. I was horrified by what I'd done, and horrified more that I hadn't known. Where was the outrage? There was enormous overlap between vegetarian and organic proponents, both residing under a rough progressive to radical sustainability banner. There was a vague, everybody who knew that veal meant torture, that herbs were the people's medicine and could cure anything, that Oreos contained lard. Mollusks are animals, why didn't anyone care? And for 1 second I knew the answer. Slugs couldn't scream. Copper barriers repelled slugs, but I couldn't afford those. I tried the really woo-woo stuff. I prayed, I sang, I burned sacred herbs from continents near and far. I left offerings, I pleaded with the great slug mother. But the lesser slugs didn't care. They wanted to eat, and I couldn't blame them. So I tried hand-picking. I set the alarm to the middle of the night and stumbled out into the dark where the cold dew soaked right through my vegan canvas sneakers. I picked and picked and picked. I slowed the rate at which they were winning, but they still won. And the next morning I had a plastic container full of slugs. What now? Was there a farm slug sanctuary somewhere? I'd wedge my feet back into my still damp sneakers, hop on my bike, and ride down to where the houses ended and a little stretch of woods began. And, I know, the suspense must be killing you, I let them go. Which, as you can imagine, took a wee bit longer than releasing, say, a squirrel. Eventually they all slimed their way to freedom. But the wait gave me time to observe and to let the observation swell into knowledge. There wasn't much for them to eat here, not compared to my garden. 2 + 2 =... That's why there were so many in my garden. Okay, we're up to page 60, and I've been reading for 30 minutes, and my voice hurts, so I'm going to quit. This chapter will end someday. I think it goes up to like 90 pages or something ridiculous. And we're up to page 60. So another endless chapter in the vegetarian myth to page 60.